A rich woman humiliates a poor servant, but the next day, she is shocked to see who bought her mansion.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The show is about to begin, Clara whispered before opening the door. Dearest Martha, it's such a joy to see you, Clara exclaimed, embracing a woman dressed elegantly. Clara, you look absolutely stunning, Martha replied, giving air kisses on both of Clara's cheeks. Guests began arriving in increasing numbers. Rosa moved silently among them, serving drinks and appetizers, while Clara stood out as the center of attention. Have you seen Valentino's new collection? Clara remarked to a group of women. It's stunning, I'm thinking of buying the whole set for the next season. Laughter and conversation filled the air, blending with the clinking of champagne glasses. Rosa observed from the shadows, moving swiftly to keep trays full and glasses replenished. At one point during the evening, while serving champagne to a group of guests, Rosa couldn't help overhearing their conversation. Have you heard about the Gomez family scandal? One woman whispered. Word is, they lost their entire fortune in a scam. How awful, another responded. Imagine having it all and then losing everything. Rosa felt a pang in her stomach. That story sounded painfully familiar to her. Rosa. Clara's voice cracked like a whip. What are you standing there for? Bring more ice. Rosa quickly headed to the kitchen, sensing some pitying glances from a few of the guests. When she returned with the ice, she saw Clara in a quiet corner, speaking in hushed tones to a man in a dark suit. I'm telling you, this is a golden opportunity, the man said. With your investment, we could double the profits in less than a year. That does sound intriguing, Gabriel, Clara replied. But you know me, I never mix business with pleasure. Let's discuss this later at the office. Rosa walked past them, pretending not to have heard anything. Yet, there was something about the man's tone that unsettled her. The evening continued, and the champagne kept flowing. The guests grew merrier, their laughter ringing louder. Rosa noticed that Clara had been drinking more than usual. Her cheeks were flushed, and her laughter was slightly too loud. Attention, everyone! Clara suddenly shouted, climbing onto a chair. I want to make a toast. The guests turned to her expectantly. Rosa moved closer with a tray of glasses. I toast to myself, Clara began with a smug smile. To my success, my beauty, and my exceptional ability to host the best parties in the city. Laughter and applause rippled through the room. Rosa, now standing directly beneath Clara, serving glasses to nearby guests, sensed something was off. And while we're here, Clara continued, her voice slightly slurred. I also toast to those who have nothing, to the failures, to those who serve us champagne. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Some guests began exchanging uneasy glances. Dearest Clara, Martha interjected. Perhaps you should come down now. But Clara wasn't ready to stop. With a dramatic gesture, she pointed toward Rosa. Take my maid, Rosa, for example. Rosa, come here. Rosa, feeling all eyes on her, reluctantly stepped closer. This woman, Clara went on. Could have been someone. But look at her now, serving those above her station. She is a living testament to what happens when you lack ambition, when you don't fight for what you want. Rosa felt tears welling up but kept her composure. Some guests began whispering, visibly uncomfortable. Madam, Rosa said softly. Perhaps you should. Shut up. Clara snapped. No, Rosa. It's time everyone knew the truth, that people like you exist only to serve people like us. At that moment, as if fate had decided to end the humiliation, Clara lost her balance while trying to steady herself. She stumbled into the tray Rosa was holding. Glasses flew into the air, spilling champagne all over Rosa's dress and the marble floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed throughout the room, followed by a collective gasp. Rosa stood frozen, soaked in champagne, shards of glass scattered at her feet. Clara, with the help of a few guests, managed not to fall. She stared at the scene before her in horror. "Look at what you've done," she screamed, her face twisted in anger. "You're absolutely useless." Rosa trembled as she began to kneel to pick up the shattered glass. "No!" Clara shouted. "Get out of here right now. Go to the kitchen and don't come out until I say so." Blushing deeply from embarrassment, Rosa headed toward the kitchen, acutely aware of the pitying and scornful gazes following her. Behind her, she heard Clara attempting to regain control of the situation. "Come now, my dear friends, it seems the show is over. Who wants more champagne? Of course, the kind that isn't on the floor." Awkward laughter rippled through the crowd as the party tried to recover its atmosphere. In the kitchen, Rosa finally let her tears fall. She removed her soaked apron and caught her reflection in a large pot. Her uniform was ruined, her hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were red and swollen with tears. "How did I get here?" she whispered, recalling the bright days when she was the one hosting grand parties, not serving them. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her from her thoughts. She quickly wiped her tears and tried to regain her composure. Martha, Clara's friend, entered the kitchen, her expression a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. "Rosa," she said gently. "Are you all right?" Rosa couldn't find the words to respond, afraid her voice would betray her. "What Clara did was wrong," Martha continued. "We all feel ashamed of her behavior." "Thank you," Rosa finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, I know it's not my place, but have you ever thought about finding another job? I know some people who could help." Before she could finish, the kitchen door swung open. Clara stepped in, slightly unsteady, her face a mask of anger barely held in check. "What are you doing in here?" Clara demanded, her voice laced with suspicion. Martha straightened, maintaining an air of composure. "I just came to get more ice, dear. You know, some of your guests are quite particular." Clara narrowed her eyes, glancing from Martha to Rosa. "Fine," she said at last. "Get your ice and return to the party. I need to speak with my staff." Martha cast Rosa one last worried look before leaving, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed was heavy. Rosa stood frozen, unmoving, while Clara eyed her like a predator assessing its prey. "So," Clara began, her tone dangerously sweet. "You think you can turn my guests against me?" Rosa looked up, startled. "No, ma'am, I would never." Silence. Clara barked, slamming her hand down on the counter. The loud bang made Rosa flinch. "What did Martha say to you? Were you complaining, looking for sympathy?" "No, ma'am," Rosa tried to remain calm. "Mrs. Martha just came in to get ice." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Do you think I'm stupid? I know how these things work. People like you are always looking for a way to take advantage, to climb higher." Rosa felt something inside her break. Years of enduring disappointment and humiliation seemed to rise to the surface. "Ma'am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I assure you, I have no intentions." "Don't interrupt me." Clara roared, stepping closer to Rosa until their faces were only inches apart. Her breath, heavy with the smell of alcohol, was suffocating. "Listen closely," Clara said, her voice low and venomous. "You're here because of my generosity. I can throw you out on the street at any time. Do you understand?" Rosa couldn't find her voice to respond. "Good," Clara continued, stepping back slightly. "Now, you will clean up the mess you made, and tomorrow you will take my dress to the cleaners. If they can't remove the stain, the cost will come out of your paycheck." "But ma'am," Rosa weakly protested. "It was an accident. You were on the chair and—" The sound of a slap echoed through the kitchen. Rosa raised a hand to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Clara looked at her, her own surprise quickly replaced by a cold, determined glare. Never, ever talk back to me again, understood? Rosa felt tears stream down her face as she nodded silently. Good, Clara said. Now clean up this mess and get out of my sight. I don't want to see you for the rest of the evening. With that, Clara turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Rosa alone with her pain and humiliation. For a few minutes, Rosa stood motionless, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, with mechanical movements, she began cleaning the kitchen. As she worked, fragments of memories from her past life surfaced, her family's grand home, elegant parties, and her parents' love. All of it now felt like a distant dream. Outside, the party continued. Laughter and music seeped through the walls, a cruel reminder of the life Rosa once had and now merely served. Hours later, after the last guest had left and Clara had retired to her bedroom, Rosa finally finished cleaning the grand villa. Once a scene of opulence and excess just hours before, it now lay in an eerie silence. With weary steps, Rosa climbed the stairs to her small attic room. Closing the door behind her, she finally allowed herself to collapse. Sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, she wept silently, her shoulders shaking with each ragged breath. When she finally calmed down, Rosa stood and walked to a small cabinet holding her meager belongings. From the top drawer, she retrieved an old shoebox. Inside, carefully wrapped in a silk scarf, was a pearl necklace. "Mother," she whispered, stroking the pearls with reverence. "What would you say if you saw me now?" The necklace was the only remnant of her past life, a constant reminder of what she had lost and who she used to be. Holding it against her chest, Rosa closed her eyes and allowed herself to dream of a different future, if only for a moment. A noise in the hallway startled her. Quickly, she hid the necklace in its place and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring another day, another trial of endurance. As she lay down, a determination began to form in Rosa's mind. She couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. With that thought, she closed her eyes, letting exhaustion pull her into a restless sleep. In her luxurious bedroom, Clara also couldn't sleep. The alcohol had worn off, leaving behind a pounding headache and a vague sense of unease. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, the speech, the stumble, the slap she'd given Rosa. For a fleeting moment, regret crossed her mind. Perhaps she had gone too far. But the thought quickly vanished. No, she told herself. I am Clara Morgan. I don't apologize. I don't regret. The world is always at my feet, and it will remain so. With that belief, Clara finally drifted off, unaware of the twists of fate awaiting her. The next morning, Rosa awoke before dawn, as usual. Her cheek still ached slightly, a reminder of the humiliation from the night before. Silently, she dressed, steeling herself mentally and emotionally for another day of serving Clara. As she descended the stairs toward the kitchen, Rosa heard voices coming from Clara's study. Curious, she moved closer to the slightly open door. You can't be serious, Clara's voice was tense. I'm sorry, Clara, but it's true, a man's voice replied, one Rosa recognized as Gabriel, who had spoken with Clara at the party. The market crashed overnight. All our investments are gone. What do you mean, gone? Clara demanded, her voice rising. Explain. Rosa heard the sound of papers being shuffled. Look at these numbers, Gabriel said. Our key assets are in freefall. Investors are pulling out en masse, and there are rumors that the Securities Commission is investigating some of our recent transactions. That's impossible. Clara shouted. We took every precaution. No one could have known. Someone did, Gabriel interrupted. I don't know who, but someone tipped off the authorities. Clara, this is serious. We could be facing criminal charges. The sound of something breaking made Rosa jump. She imagined Clara hurling an expensive object against the wall in a fit of rage. "Fix it," Clara commanded. "I don't care how, but fix it. Use my personal accounts if necessary. I'm not losing everything I've built." "Clara," Gabriel said, his voice weary. "We've already drained your personal accounts. They're empty. Everything was used to try and cover the company's losses." A deathly silence followed his statement. Rosa held her breath, struggling to comprehend what she was hearing. "What are you saying?" Clara finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying," Gabriel replied slowly, as if forcing himself to say the words. "You're bankrupt. Clara, the company, your personal accounts, everything, it's all gone." The scream that followed made Rosa step back from the door. She had never heard Clara make such a sound, a mix of anger, disbelief, and utter fear. "Get out!" Clara bellowed. "Get out of my house now." Rosa barely managed to hide in a nearby closet as the study door burst open. She saw Gabriel hurrying out, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Behind him, Clara emerged, her hair disheveled and her eyes bloodshot. "This isn't over." Clara screamed after him. "I'll find a way to fix this, and when I do, I'll destroy you." Gabriel didn't respond, walking quickly out of the house. Clara stood motionless in the hallway, breathing heavily. For a moment, she looked lost, vulnerable. Then, as if sensing Rosa's presence, she suddenly turned around. "Rosa!" Clara called out. "Rosa, come here immediately." Rosa stepped out from her hiding spot, dreading what was about to happen. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her head bowed. Clara looked at her, her eyes scanning Rosa as if seeing her for the first time. Then, to Rosa's surprise, Clara began to laugh. It was a wild, almost hysterical laugh. "Oh, Rosa," Clara said between laughs. "Isn't it ironic? Last night, I humiliated you in front of everyone, called you a failure, and now look at me, the great Clara Morgan, reduced to nothing in just a matter of hours." Rosa didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated by Clara's downfall, but another part, the part raised with compassion, felt a pang of pity. "Ma'am," she began, but Clara cut her off with a sharp gesture. "No, don't say anything. I don't need your pity." Clara straightened herself, attempting to regain a semblance of her usual poise. "This is just a minor setback," she said. "I'll find a way out. I always do." With that, Clara turned on her heel and ascended the stairs, leaving Rosa alone in the hallway, trying to process everything that had just transpired. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Rosa went about her daily chores, cleaning and organizing, but the absence of Clara was palpable. There were no orders, no shouting, just an eerie silence that permeated every corner of the villa. Near dusk, as Rosa was preparing dinner despite receiving no instructions, she heard the doorbell ring. Turning off the stove, she went to answer it. Standing on the threshold was a man in a suit, his face stern and a briefcase in hand. "Good evening," the man said. "I'm attorney Richard Taylor. I need to speak with Mrs. Morgan immediately." Rosa felt a sudden unease. "Of course, sir. Please wait here, and I'll let her know." She climbed the stairs, her heart racing. Something terrible was about to happen, she could feel it. Reaching Clara's door, she knocked gently. "Mrs. Morgan, there's an attorney here to see you. He says it's urgent." There was no response at first. Then, the door slowly creaked open. Clara appeared, looking completely different from the proud woman Rosa knew. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her eyes were red and swollen. "An attorney?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "He said his name is Richard Taylor, ma'am." Clara's face visibly paled. "No," she muttered. "No, no, it's too soon. Without another word, she pushed past Rosa and hurried down the stairs. Rosa followed nervously, afraid of what might unfold. In the living room, Clara and Attorney Taylor began a tense conversation. Rosa stayed in the background, pretending to arrange a few books while quietly listening. "There are no other options, Mrs. Morgan," Taylor said. "Given the accusations being brought forward and the scale of the losses, the board has decided to freeze all your assets." "They can't do that," Clara shouted, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "This house is mine. Everything here belongs to me." Taylor shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and professionalism. "I'm afraid that's no longer the case, Mrs. Morgan. Everything, including this house, is being seized as part of the investigation." From her hidden corner, Rosa felt the ground shift beneath her. What did "seized" mean? Would she lose her job, her place to live? Clara collapsed into a chair, all her pride drained away. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the property," Taylor replied. "A team will arrive to inventory and secure everything. I suggest you only pack essential and personal items. Anything of value will need to remain here." Clara nodded mechanically, her eyes staring blankly into the distance. Taylor, sensing there was nothing more to say, stood up. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Morgan," he said, though his tone indicated this was more a formality than genuine sentiment. "My office will be in touch to handle the legal proceedings." With that, he left. Rosa followed him to the door, still trying to process everything she'd overheard. As Taylor departed, Rosa returned to the living room. Clara remained seated, unmoving, like a statue. "Ma'am," Rosa said gently. "Is there anything I can do?" Clara looked up, her eyes meeting Rosa's. For a moment, Rosa saw vulnerability, fear, and deep sorrow in those eyes, eyes that had always looked at her with disdain. "You," Clara said hoarsely. "You must be enjoying this." "It's not true, ma'am," Rosa shook her head. "I don't feel that way at all." "Don't lie," Clara shouted, suddenly standing up. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Waiting for me to fall, waiting for me to lose everything. Fine. Congratulations, your wish has come true." Rosa stepped back, startled by Clara's outburst. "Mrs. Morgan, I assure you, I have never." "Silence," Clara roared. "I don't want to hear your lies, your fake pity. You're just like all of them, always watching, always waiting, ready to revel in my downfall." Clara began pacing, her voice growing louder with each word. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked for all of this? Do you know what I sacrificed? And now, in the blink of an eye, it's all gone, everything." Rosa remained silent, knowing that anything she said now would only make things worse. Clara stopped in front of an ornate mirror, staring at her disheveled reflection. "Look at me," she said, more to herself than to Rosa. The great Clara Morgan, now left with nothing. No home, no money, nothing. Then, with a sudden movement, Clara punched the mirror. The glass shattered, shards falling to the floor as blood began dripping from her knuckles. "Ma'am!" Rosa exclaimed, rushing toward Clara. "You're hurt. Let me help you." But Clara shoved her away harshly. "Don't touch me. I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help." Rosa backed away, her heart pounding. She had never seen Clara like this, so unrestrained, so painfully human. "Go," Clara said, her voice suddenly calm. "Pack your things and leave. You don't work here anymore. There's nothing left for you here." Rosa hesitated. "But ma'am, your hand." "I said go." Clara screamed, turning to glare at her with eyes full of anger and tears. "Get out of my sight, get out of my house." With a heavy heart, Rosa nodded and climbed the stairs. As she walked away, she could hear the sound of more objects breaking in the living room, mixed with Clara's uncontrollable sobs. In her small attic room, Rosa began packing her few belongings: clothes, a couple of books, a photo of her parents, and the pearl necklace, all of her life condensed into an old, battered suitcase. As she closed the suitcase, Rosa couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Less than 24 hours ago, Clara had humiliated her in front of everyone, treating her as nothing more than a failure. And now, both of them were in the same position, without a home, without a job, facing an uncertain future. Rosa sat on the edge of her bed, allowing herself a moment of thought. Part of her wanted to feel satisfied at Clara's downfall, a sort of poetic justice. But another part, the part her parents had raised with compassion and empathy, felt a deep sadness for the woman who had been her employer. After all, Rosa thought, they had both experienced the loss of everything they once knew. Rosa had gone through it years ago when her family's fortune disappeared, and now Clara was facing the same cruel fate. With a sigh, Rosa stood, picked up her suitcase, and with one last look at the room that had been her home for years, she stepped out and closed the door behind her. As she descended the stairs, the silence in the villa was deafening. There was no sign of Clara. Rosa paused in the foyer, unsure of what to do. Should she leave without saying anything? Should she try to say goodbye? Finally, she decided to leave a note. Taking a piece of paper from the desk in the foyer, she wrote: Mrs. Morgan, I'm leaving as you requested. I'm deeply sorry for everything that has happened. Despite our differences, I wish you the best. If you ever need help, you can find me at the Cozy Cafe on Main Street. I work there on weekends. Rosa left the note in a visible spot, and with one final glance at the villa, she opened the door and stepped outside. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the street in a soft glow. Rosa paused on the sidewalk, her suitcase in hand, looking toward the uncertain future that lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, she moved forward, leaving the Morgan villa and this chapter of her life behind. As she walked away, Rosa couldn't help but think of Clara. What would she do now? Where would she go? For a brief moment, Rosa considered going back to offer help one last time. But she knew it would be pointless. Clara was too proud to accept help, especially from someone she considered beneath her. Rosa shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. She needed to focus on her own future now, on rebuilding her life once again. With determination in her eyes, Rosa kept walking, leaving the mansion and the painful memories of humiliation and suffering behind. What neither woman realized at that moment was that fate had very different plans for them, plans that would bring them face to face again under circumstances neither could have imagined. As Rosa walked down the street and Clara remained alone in the house she was about to lose, the sun began to set, marking the end of a day that had changed their lives forever. The first chapter of their shared story had closed, but a new one was just beginning, one filled with unexpected twists and remarkable discoveries. The sound of a ringing phone jolted Clara out of a restless sleep. For a moment, she felt disoriented, reaching out instinctively for the soft silk sheets she had grown used to. Instead, her fingers touched rough, scratchy fabric. Reality hit her like a bucket of cold water. She was no longer in her luxurious mansion. This was her new home, a cheap boarding house on the outskirts of the city. Another night in this hellhole, she muttered, rubbing her eyes. She sat up slowly, her body protesting against the uncomfortable bed. The cracked mirror before her reflected a face she barely recognized, dark circles under hollow eyes, disheveled hair, a shadow of the woman she once was. The phone rang again, snapping her out of her daze. It was the latest smartphone, one of the few luxuries she still owned. She picked it up cautiously, dreading more bad news. "Hello?" she answered, her voice hoarse from sleep and stress. "Clara, it's me, Gabriel," the voice on the other end said. Clara tensed immediately. "What do you want? Have you called to gloat over my misery?" "No, not at all," Gabriel replied, his voice sounding weary. I have news, and it's not good. Worse? How could it possibly get worse? Clara snapped, her voice dripping with bitterness. There was silence on the other end before Gabriel finally spoke. The board has decided to fully cooperate with the Securities Commission investigation. They're handing over all the documents, including the ones directly tied to the questionable transactions you approved. Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. They can't do that, she whispered. Those documents will destroy me. I'm sorry, Clara, Gabriel said. I tried to convince them, but they're desperate to salvage whatever they can from the company. You're the perfect scapegoat. Scapegoat. Clara roared, her anger replacing the initial shock. You were the one who suggested those deals in the first place. And you were the one who approved them, Gabriel shot back, his voice growing firm, leaving Clara staring at the phone in disbelief and fear. No, 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 she muttered, pacing back and forth in the small room. This can't be happening. Her mind raced. Where could she go? She had no money, no connections. All her so-called friends had abandoned her the moment news of her downfall spread. In her panic, her eyes fell on a local newspaper lying on the rickety table. A small classified ad in the corner of the page caught her attention, looking for cafe staff. No experience required. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Me, working as a waitress. What a cruel joke fate has played on me. But as she stared at the ad, an idea began to form. No one would look for the great Clara Morgan in a rundown cafe. It might just be the perfect place to lay low. With trembling hands, she dialed the number listed in the ad. Central Cafe, how can I help you? A cheerful voice answered. Clara swallowed, forcing herself to speak. I'd like to come in for an interview for the waitress position this afternoon, around 3 p.m. Of course. See you at 3, the voice replied. I'll be there, Clara said quickly, hanging up. She stared into the mirror again, seeing a reflection that was both determined and desperate. All right, Clara, she told herself. It's time to become someone else. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Clara rummaged through her suitcase, trying to find something that didn't scream, former millionaire in despair. She finally settled on simple jeans and a white blouse, clothing she would never have considered wearing before. By 2:30 p.m., Clara left her boarding house, unrecognizable to anyone who had known her in her previous life. Her long brown hair, once her pride and joy, was tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore no makeup, and a pair of cheap sunglasses covered her eyes. She looked like a completely different person. The Central Cafe was only a few blocks away. As she walked, Clara couldn't help but notice the stares from passers-by. These weren't the admiring glances she was accustomed to but indifferent looks that passed over her as though she were invisible, just another face in the crowd. When she reached the cafe, Clara hesitated for a moment outside the door. The small, cozy cafe was nothing like the upscale restaurants she used to frequent. For a moment, she considered turning around and leaving, but Gabriel's call flashed in her mind, and she steeled herself. The small bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods surrounded her. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman with a kind smile. Welcome to Central Cafe. How can I help you? The woman greeted. Clara cleared her throat. I'm here for the interview for the waitress position. The woman seemed momentarily surprised but quickly recovered her smile. Oh, of course. I'm Daniela, the owner. Please follow me to the back room, and we'll talk there. Clara followed Daniela, feeling increasingly out of place. The back room was small and cozy, with a round table at its center. Have a seat, Daniela said, gesturing to a chair. What's your name? Clara hesitated for a moment. She couldn't use her real name. Clara. Clara Valdez, she answered, using her mother's maiden name. Good, Clara, Daniela smiled. Tell me, do you have any experience as a waitress? Clara stammered. How could she explain that she had never worked a day in her life? Daniela seemed to sense her discomfort. Don't worry. If you don't have experience, that's fine. Everyone starts somewhere. What brought you to Central Café? Clara took a deep breath. It was now or never. To be honest, she began, surprising even herself with the truth she was about to reveal. I'm going through a rough time. I've lost everything recently. I need a fresh start, and this job might be my chance. Daniela studied her silently for a moment, her eyes filled with understanding. I appreciate your honesty, Clara. It's not easy to admit when we're struggling. Clara lowered her head, feeling a mix of shame and relief. Daniela continued. Look, I can't promise you much. The work is tough, the hours are long, and the pay isn't great. But if you're willing to learn and work hard, I'm willing to give you a chance. Clara looked up, surprised. Really? But I have no experience. I don't know anything about being a waitress. Daniela smiled. Everyone has to start somewhere. Besides, I have a good feeling about you. What do you say? Want to give it a try? For a moment, Clara was speechless. Just a week ago, she had been running a multimillion-dollar company, and now she was about to accept a job as a waitress. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Yes, she finally said. I want to try. Great, Daniela said, standing up. You'll start tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. I have to warn you, the first few days will be tough. But if you stick with it, you'll pick it up quickly. Clara nodded, feeling overwhelmed. Thank you, Daniela. I won't let you down. As she left the cafe, Clara felt as if she were in a daze. She had just accepted a job as a waitress. The reality of her situation hit her hard. Returning to her boarding house, Clara collapsed onto the bed, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She stared at her phone, tempted to call one of her old friends for help. But she knew it was useless. She was completely alone in this. A notification jolted her from her thoughts. It was a news alert. Her heart pounding, Clara opened the article. Financial scandal, former CEO Clara Morgan wanted for questioning. The article detailed the allegations against her: fraud, embezzlement, and insider trading. A photo of her, taken during her glory days, topped the article. Damn it, Clara muttered, letting the phone fall from her hands. This wasn't just about lying low anymore. She was officially a target of the authorities. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Clara forced herself to remain calm. Think, Clara, think, she told herself. She had gotten out of bad situations before. But as she looked around the dingy boarding house, she realized she had never been in a situation as dire as this. She had always had money, connections, power. Now, she had nothing. With trembling hands, she rummaged through her suitcase. At the bottom, wrapped in a silk blouse, she found a small bottle of sleeping pills. She had bought them months ago during an especially stressful time at work. For a brief, dark moment, she considered swallowing them all and ending it. But the thought was quickly dismissed. No, Clara Morgan never gives up that easily. Instead, she took one pill and swallowed it dry. She needed sleep. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first day of her new life as a waitress. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the irony of her situation. Just days ago, she had humiliated her maid, Rosa, looking down on her as someone inferior. And now, she was about to become the very thing she once despised. Morning came too quickly. The alarm blared at 5 a.m., pulling Clara from her restless sleep. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But reality hit her fast. Today was her first day as a waitress. She forced herself out of bed, her body protesting from exhaustion and accumulated stress. Standing in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, Clara barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "Come on, Clara," she told herself. "You ran a multi-million-dollar company. You can handle one shift as a waitress." But as she dressed in the jeans and white shirt from the day before, a voice in her head whispered, "Do you really think you can do this? You've never worked a day in your life." Clara shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She had no other choice. It was this or face the authorities. When Clara arrived at Central Café, it was just about to open. Daniela was already there, setting up the coffee machine and placing pastries on display. "Good morning, Clara," Daniela greeted her with a warm smile. "Ready for your first day?" Clara nodded, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "Ready as I'll ever be." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Daniela showed Clara how to operate the coffee machine, take orders, and carry multiple cups of coffee at once without spilling them. For Clara, who was used to giving orders rather than receiving them, each new task was a challenge. "Remember to smile," Daniela kept reminding her. "Customers don't just come for the coffee, they come for the atmosphere." Clara bit her lip to keep from responding. Smile. How does anyone smile when their life is falling apart? It didn't take long for the first difficult customer to arrive. A middle-aged man in a suit, carrying a briefcase, walked in with a scowl on his face. "A double espresso to go, and make it quick, I have a meeting in 10 minutes, he barked at Clara without even looking at her. Clara felt her blood boil. How dare he speak to her like that? She nearly snapped back at him in the same tone, but the warning look from Daniela stopped her. "Yes, sir," Clara replied through clenched teeth, walking over to the coffee machine. Her hands shook as she tried to recall the steps Daniela had taught her. Was it coffee first or the cup? How long for a double espresso? "What's taking so long?" the man shouted. "I said I'm in a hurry." Clara clenched her fists, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Finally, she managed to prepare the espresso and handed it to him. "Here you go, sir." "Have a nice day," she said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. The man grumbled something unintelligible and rushed out. Clara turned back to Daniela, expecting to be scolded for her slowness. Instead, she was met with a look of understanding. "The first difficult customer is always the worst," Daniela said gently. "You handled it well. You'll get used to it." Clara felt strangely touched by Daniela's kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll try to do better next time." As the morning went on, Clara began to find her rhythm. She still made mistakes, spilling coffee on the counter twice and mixing up a few orders, but slowly, she started to improve. During a quiet moment while cleaning a table, Clara couldn't help but reflect on her situation. Just days ago, she was the one giving orders, looking down on people like the customers she was now serving. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the jingle of the doorbell. She looked up and felt her heart stop. Walking into the cafe was Martha, one of her old friends from her socialite days. For a moment, Clara panicked, considering running into the kitchen, but before she could move, Martha spotted her. Martha's eyes widened, filled with shock and a hint of pity. "Clara?" Martha approached her. "Is that you? Oh my God, what are you doing here?" Clara straightened, trying to reclaim some of her old dignity. "I'm working here," she said, her voice tense. Martha looked her up and down, unable to hide her disbelief. "But, the news said you're wanted by the authorities. Everyone thought you'd fled the country." Clara felt a wave of fear rise in her chest. If Martha had recognized her, who else might? "Martha," Clara said quietly, leaning in closer. "Please, I'm begging you, don't tell anyone you saw me here." Martha hesitated for a moment, then, to Clara's surprise, nodded. I won't say anything, I promise. But Clara, what are you doing? You should turn yourself in, talk to a lawyer. I can't, Clara interrupted. Not yet. I need time to think, to figure out my next step. Martha looked at her with a mixture of concern and pity. All right, she said finally. But be careful, Clara. You can't hide forever. With that, Martha turned and left the cafe, leaving Clara trembling with both fear and relief. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Clara. Every time the door opened, she braced herself, expecting the police to walk in and arrest her. Every familiar face made her shrink back, afraid of being recognized again. By the time her shift finally ended, Clara was physically and emotionally drained. Her feet ached, her hands smelled of coffee and cleaning products, and her mind couldn't stop replaying her encounter with Martha. Daniela approached her as she was getting ready to leave. You did well today, Clara, Daniela said with a kind smile. I know it's not easy, but it will get better with time. Clara nodded, too exhausted to say much. She accepted the small envelope containing her day's wages and stepped out into the night. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Back in her boarding house, Clara collapsed onto her bed without even bothering to take off her shoes. She pulled out the envelope and stared at it. The money she had earned after a full day of hard work was barely enough to pay for a few more nights in her cheap room. The tears she had been holding back all day finally began to fall. How had it come to this? How had the great Clara Morgan fallen so low? One day, while Clara was reviewing the cafe's accounting records in the office, Daniela walked in with an unusual expression on her face. Clara, Daniela said, her voice tense. There's someone here to see you. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Clara followed Daniela to the front of the cafe. Standing by the counter was the last person she expected to see, Rosa, her former maid. Rosa! Clara exclaimed, unable to hide her surprise. Rosa looked at her, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. Hello, Clara, she said softly. It's been a while. Sensing the tension, Daniela interjected. I'll leave you two to talk. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. As Daniela left, an awkward silence fell between the two women. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Rosa, I don't know what to say. The last time we saw each other, You humiliated me, Rosa interrupted, her tone firm but not accusatory. Yes, I remember it well. Clara lowered her head, shame evident on her face. I'm so sorry, Rosa, for everything. I know that my apology might not mean much now, but I truly regret what I did. Rosa looked at her for a moment before nodding slightly. I appreciate your apology, Clara. And I have to admit, I'm surprised to see you working here at this cafe. Life has its twists and turns, Clara replied with a sad smile. I suppose now I have a better understanding of what you went through. Rosa smiled faintly. Life certainly has a strange way of teaching us lessons. There was another pause, this time less tense than before. Finally, Rosa spoke again. Clara, I didn't come here to reopen old wounds. I came because, well, I've bought your old mansion. Clara's eyes widened in shock. But how? Rosa took a deep breath before explaining. After you lost everything, I went back to my previous life. It turns out that my family had been fighting for years to reclaim a stolen inheritance. We finally won the case, and with the settlement money, I bought the mansion when it went up for auction. Clara stared at her, trying to process the information. That's incredible, Rosa. I'm truly happy for you. Rosa looked at her seriously. Thank you, but there's more. I'm turning the mansion into a support center for women who've lost everything and need a fresh start. And I wanted to know if you'd like to be involved. Clara felt her eyes fill with tears. Me? But after everything I did to you. The past is the past, Clara, Rosa said gently, cutting her off. We've both changed, and I think your experiences could be invaluable to these women. Clara was silent for a moment, overwhelmed by Rosa's generosity. Finally, in a trembling voice, she replied. I'd be honored to help, Rosa. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Rosa smiled and extended her hand. So, do we have a deal? Clara grasped Rosa's hand, feeling as though a circle had been completed. Yes, she confirmed as they shook hands. Daniela stepped out of the kitchen, her face lighting up with a knowing smile. Everything okay? She asked, glancing between the two women. Clara and Rosa exchanged a look before nodding. Better than okay, Clara replied. In fact, I think this is the beginning of something truly special. Daniela beamed. I'm so glad to hear that. How about we celebrate with a cup of coffee? On the house. As the three women sat down to chat, Clara couldn't help but marvel at the unexpected twists her life had taken, from the heights of corporate success to the depths of despair, and now, finally, finding a path toward redemption and purpose. Looking at Rosa and Daniela, Clara realized she had found something money could never buy, genuine friendship and the chance to make a meaningful impact. You know, Rosa, Clara said, sipping her coffee. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm truly grateful for everything that's happened. It made me realize what's really important in life. Rosa nodded in understanding. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find our true path. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, to their mutual surprise, they embraced. Daniela watched the scene unfold, a radiant smile on her face. Now that, she said, is what I call a new dawn. The three parted ways that evening, each heading to their respective homes with hearts full of hope and anticipation for what lay ahead. As Clara walked back to her modest apartment, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment, from arrogance to humility, from wealth to poverty, and back to something far more valuable, a life of meaning. Tomorrow would mark the first day of the rest of her life, and for the first time in a long while, Clara Morgan felt genuinely excited about what the future might hold. The story of Clara and Rosa teaches us that true wealth lies not in material possessions but in the lessons of humility, forgiveness, and empathy we accumulate throughout life. Clara's downfall and Rosa's generosity show that when we lose everything, we gain the opportunity to reconnect with what truly matters. Sometimes, it is through life's hardships that we transform ourselves and come to appreciate the value of genuine friendships and a purpose-driven life.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.